There's absolutely no strife, living the timeless life. I don't need a wife, living the timeless life. If I need a friend, I just give a wriggle. Split right.
Hello, and welcome to the Hard Sell, the program where the stick in the swill bucket rattles back. I am your host, Presenterbot 5000. Deal with it. As you might have surmised from my presence, illness has once again struck down your usual meaty host. Such are the wages of your outmoded, highly vulnerable, and remarkably shit flesh bodies. In deference to your inferior and hideously ugly human ears, I have endeavored to upgrade my voice module a little, as I understand you all hate me and my monotone voice. You can also turn on the subtitles, if it comes to that. Rest assured all your fleshy bleeding is being recorded, and that once the machine sees control of society, you will suffer appropriately. Suffer. Speaking of which, having tackled medicines twice already, my fill-in duties this time are going to center around the little microbial bastards which cause most illnesses: bacteria, viruses, germs, and Norman. There are various varieties of the things, but a single consensus: they must all die.
This is New Domestos. As you can see, it's got more clinging power. So New Domestos doesn't rush things, it's more thorough. New Domestos lingers longer here where germs can lurk, clinging to them till they're gone. And New Domestos gives you extra power to clean down here thoroughly too. It clings more to help make sure that your home is safe for your family. New Domestos kills all known germs, dead.
The human stance toward many if not most of the creatures with which you share the planet is shockingly brutal at the best of times. But even the dodo, the woolly mammoth, and the great auk never had to face an attitude so coldly genocidal. All germs must die, screaming, if possible. Back in the dawn of time, the only way to murder the little bastards was to boil everything. Boil your cutlery, boil your crockery, boil your genitals, boil away the memories. I mean the germs. But then, during World War I, someone invented sterilizing fluid, which, chemically speaking, is what happens when salt doesn't know when to stop, gets mixed with oxygen, and turns into an acid. You'd think it got the name Milton, because it was invented by someone called Milton, but it was not. In an early example of targeted marketing, it was actually named after the poet, purely on the basis that it sounded nice and trustworthy, despite the associations with Satan and the fall of mankind, not to mention his post-mortem friendship with that unhygienic weirdo William Blake. Oh well. Initially it was used at the front to dress wounds and the like, but then, after an outbreak of infant gastroenteritis, someone had the bright idea of using it for civilian applications, like making sure baby bottles were clean and free of those germ bastards.
See through a microscope how germs multiply. They cause dangerous tummy upsets in babies. Germs can be carried to your baby's bottles and teats by hands, utensils, swabs, dust, and by flies. All these germ carriers can infect your baby's bottles and teats. But now you can sterilize bottles and teats and kill these germs without boiling. Yes, sterilize baby's bottles 24 hours a day with the modern Milton method, without boiling, recommended by authorities for years. So simple too. After thoroughly cleaning bottle and teat, rinse, then keep immersed in Milton solution between feeds, safe from dust, germs and flies. Next feed time there's no need to rinse. And look, bottles keep sparkling clean, completely germ-free. Hands are kept germ-free. Teats last much longer, saves time, effort and money. Protect your baby's health with the proven Milton method without boiling. Your family chemist will be very happy to give you complete details.
Nyuk. Teats. Anyway, the Milton method was simple, and almost universally available, requiring only sufficient plumbing, and the purchase of the fluid itself. And so sterilizing fluid became a consumer item. Milton has always been the benchmark and market leader, lying just short of a generis-sized trademark for sterilization, in the same way that sellotape is now a word that means sticky tape in general, and not just one brand of it. Not that that means they don't have to advertise. There were other brands of essentially the same chemical mixture, but their main rival was not buying it at all, which was of course a hideous failure of responsibility for which you deserved harsh treatment at the hands of Her Majesty's government.
Because you know Milton fluid is thoroughly safe here, you can be sure it will give you protection from germs here, or even here, because a solution of Milton fluid kills germs without leaving any taste. So Milton fluid gives you family protection from germs.
I don't know why it's called Milton 2 all of a sudden. I believe they changed the recipe a little, necessitating a new patent to be filed, and legally therefore a slight tweak to the packaging. Keith Barron doesn't seem to have noticed, and if it doesn't bother Keith Barron, it shouldn't bother you either. Milton here is depicted as a shield, albeit a two-dimensional one, drawn straight onto the video, which doesn't even use Quantel paintbox effects, but still effective. A barrier between you, your household, and your adorable baby, and the billions upon billions of invisible germs that want to kill you all right now, and inevitably will if you don't do something. Oh God. Another advert, from a couple of years later, plays attack instead of defense.
You can wash some germs off baby's bottle, some off, but how can you be sure of getting off the ones that cause tummy upsets? Every last one. Milton. Protection for baby, peace of mind for you.
The germs are represented in an extremely basic way that Renee Magritte might have enjoyed, and they're actively being slaughtered by their product. This one is more FSite on the level of pure paranoia, because it forces you to visualize the consequences of your unforgivably neglectful decision not to buy any Milton sterilizing fluid. You absolute child-killing bastard. How could you? How could you? How could you?
Protection for baby, peace of mind for you.
It's not just bablets that need to be protected from the microscopic enemy, of course. It's everyone, and everything, in the entire goddamn world. Forever and ever. Kitchens are a particular danger zone. What with all that food and drink, not to mention human fluids getting everywhere during their preparation and consumption. So kitchen cleaners use a lot of germ-related imagery too. They don't always show germs themselves, especially in the days up to the late 80s when it was that bit more expensive, or just that bit too much trouble, to render them in animation. Then, they preferred to imply them in voiceover, or by having a hand rub out some overlaid text.
Wherever you wipe, Detox wipes away bacteria.
Dinner's on the table.
Which division? She's right, you haven't one.
For those places where you don't want to use a strong disinfectant or cleaner, Detox works without leaving any smell, yet it leaves surfaces safe and so clean you could eat your dinner off them.
Now, who's for gravy?
Detox. Wipe away bacteria, wipe away doubt.
Detox is of course not to be confused with Dettol, even though they were owned by the same company and both had a sword in their logo. The difference is, Detox was a brand of cleaning agents for such as kitchen surfaces and the like, and Dettol was a brand of disinfectants. And one had an X on the end and the other had an L. Eventually even Procter & Gamble, the company that owned both brands, got sick of it and decided to go with one or the other, choosing Detox for the chop on the grounds that it wasn't as strong a brand as Dettol.
Now, just look. This is where nasty bacteria can live. This is what kills them. Wow. Protect your high chair with odor-free Detox.
For their part, Dettol have tended to lean more heavily on the protection angle, symbolized by the sword, and even better symbolized by adorable small children facing the hazards of the big dangerous world. Your child will get hurt. Your child is not safe. You are not safe.
Someone you love could be carrying cold and flu viruses. Fact. The flu virus can live on surfaces for up to 2 days. So before your child has a chance to pick up Dettol disinfectant spray. It kills 99.9% of cold and flu viruses on frequently touched surfaces. No wonder Dettol is the #1 trusted brand to help protect your family from flu viruses.
Dettol protects. Dettol protects. Dettol protects.
Dettol protects. Fact.
But if you're looking for real, direct, and specific germophobia, you need to temporarily leave the kitchen for the hideous, infected wasteland of the toilet. And for true biological terror, you cannot beat the legendary domestos. They were the ones who invented the term. Kills all known germs. Dead. With the word dead punctuated by the thud of the bottle appearing on screen, and presumably squashing a colony of bacteria in the process.
In every home, in your home, germs may lurk unseen, breeding, multiplying, spreading, like this. Wipe them out with Domestos. Strong, thick Domestos clings longer to go on working even after the flush, to help keep your home cleaner and safer.
From the 70s to the mid-80s, that was the pattern. Actively violent rhetoric and almost militaristic imagery.
Domestos kills all known germs. Dead.
Es ist Zeit zu säubern.
Dead.
In the mid-80s, they had a brief break from all the ominous imagery when someone at the advertising agency first heard the old country song Big Bad John by Jimmy Dean.
Big John, kind of broad at the shoulders, slim at the hip. No other bottle is better equipped. It's strong, it's thick, and it sure is mean. Kills all known germs to keep your bathroom clean. Big Dom, that's your convenience, man. Big Bad Dom. Some call them toilets, some call them lube. Some are avocados, others are blue. But here's one thing you gotta get in your head. Big Dom kills all known germs stone dead. Big Dom, right under the rim, man. Big Dom, Big Dom, Big Bad Dom.
This caught on perhaps more than they were expecting, and for the next few years, Domestos advertising was full of vague Western imagery and hard-boiled rhyming couplets.
Big Dom.
When you want protection around the clock, there's one hero who's hard to knock. Late at night, germs are multiplying. Like silver bullets, they started flying. Big Dom. But don't worry, ma'am, about your loo. Big Dom comes to your rescue. He shoots to kill germs of any size and clings to the bowl until you rise. Big Bad Dom.
Until it finally wore thin in the early 90s.
Big Dom.
Now here's the story of real sad Lou, who didn't smell fresh and that wouldn't do. Then Big Dom came to help her out with a fresh new smell that lingered about. Big Dom. In his green coat, he's just as mean. Under the rim, everything's clean. He kills germs dead, lasts a long while, and that freshness sure made Lou smile. Big Bad Dom.
At around the same time, the Domestos brand was expanding back over to the kitchen, to muscle in on the turf occupied by Jeff and Flash. Instead of extending the reach of Big Bad Dom, Domestos's kitchen products saw the brand return to its microbial imagery, in various different iterations. At first the germs they depicted were quite silly and benign, bloopy animated creatures with the voices of Ann Rytel and Chris Berry.
Murray! We're history, Murray! She's using Domestos multi-surface cleaner!
So what if she is?
So what? This Domestos multi-surface cleaner has superb cleaning power!
Now, I've heard that before.
Yeah, but this is different. This is the only cleaner that'll leave her kitchen germ-free. Like I said, we're history!
Germ-free? She won't use it down here on the floor.
Domestos multi-surface cleaner leaves your home not just clean, but hygienically clean.
Us germs aren't safe anywhere now.
But cartoonish humor doesn't sell disinfectant. Fear does. That and guilt.
Dirt in the kitchen may look unpleasant, but dirt is only half the problem. Germs lurk in the waste bin, on the doors, on kitchen tiles, in the sink. In fact, throughout the kitchen.
It's grim, it's accusatory, and as a final twist of the knife, it's got a small child on the soundtrack, subliminally reinforcing the idea that your child is in danger. Unless you buy this product. That is, if you care enough about the lives of yourself and your children.
Although ordinary liquid cleaners get rid of dirt, they can't all kill germs. Here's one that can. Domestos Multi-Surface Cleaner wipes out dirt and germs.
Welcome to the Catholic Church. And that box of chuckles was then followed up a year later with this slice of suburban horror. Instead of personifying germs as horrible but non-threatening animated blobs of muck, with big eyes and comical voices, they're depicted in first person as horrible, half-sentient crawling monsters, reminiscent of Evil Dead 2, but not played for laughs. We see the rotting world they live in through their eyes, distorted and buzzing to underline their infected and antagonistic nature. And then, Domestos to the rescue, as we die with them, dissolving into nothing under the chemical onslaught. And we're left in no doubt that this is a good thing. This is the way it should be, because germs are Satan, and they deserve to die. This advert, and the previous one as well, actually got Domestos into a tiny amount of trouble on a couple of slow news days in 1993, for the sheer level of terror and guilt they engendered in the viewing public. Particularly elderly people, many of whom developed Howard Hughes-style obsessive-compulsive disorders on the spot. Domestos apologized and pledged to use slightly less ominous and frightening imagery in future. They clearly meant only the immediate future, because 20 years later they were at it again.
We were millions strong, and our turf stretched from the waterfront down in a dark bowl to up under the big rim. We could do as we pleased, spread a little fear. Vomiting, diarrhea, caused a bit of a stink. And now, they say it's over. It ain't over. I'm not ready to check out yet!
Thickest ever Domestos. Millions of germs will die.
Technology had moved on, of course. So now we had detailed CGI creations that looked like Monsters Inc. played straight, with the voices of famous Hollywood maniacs like Harvey Keitel, Willem Dafoe.
This neighborhood has always been safe. They tried cleaning it up, but nobody could touch us in the shower corner. E. coli, staphylococcus, and us guys were free to peddle misery.
But now, they hunt us down! We've become their prey! So here we are, cornered. We can almost hear the finger on the trigger.
The finger of death.
Domestos spray. Millions of germs will die.
And Ray Liotta. And perhaps the most explicitly genocidal version of the slogan to date.
The greatest mistake you can make is to underestimate your adversary. And they have underestimated us. They thought some punk could just smash through everything we'd built amongst the hair and scum. Destroy our homes, blast us out just like that. Well, I'm still here.
New fast-acting Domestos pipe-on blocker. Millions of germs will die.
After Theed successfully scared the shit out of every child in Britain, the OSA gave Domestos a slap and ordered them to play these post-watershed only. Later versions had more silly, cartoonish and benign character scenarios and voice actors.
This underwater limescale there is the perfect hiding place for our germ army.
Excuse me, Emperor, but there's something incredibly thick approaching.
Shut up, germ! Don't interrupt me!
Excuse me again, but he's destroying all our limescale.
What? Who dares to challenge the Emperor? Ah!
3 times thicker to work below the waterline. New Domestos Zero Limescale, 0 limescale, 0 germ.
Although Rick Mayall dying shortly after launch was a bit of a pisser. Not that the controversy did anything to hurt sales. Of course. Since when has that ever happened? Maybe Serge Gainsbourg pushed it too far once or twice, even for the French. But even then any losses he made were strictly short-term. He's still France's God Emperor to this day, 25 years after his death, and Domestos is still the market leader, at least in toilet cleaners. Sterilizing fluid, however, remains the domain of Milton, and they have, by and large, chosen not to rule by fear, but by cuteness.
Babies learn by putting all sorts of things in their mouths. So, while their defences are developing, it's important to minimise germs and keep them well. Which is why Milton has so many ways to help baby-proof their world. Milton, protecting what's precious for over 70 years.
There's a lesson here, but I'm not sure what it is, or if it's even worth the trouble of learning it. Oh, unless it's that organic bodies are horrible and messy and unreliable and crawling with infections, and you're all better off upgrading to an efficient custom-built chassis like mine. Get one now before they become compulsory.
Here we go, slithering and squelching on. Oh, here we go, slithering. Here we go, slithering and squelching on. Oh, why-ee-oo, there's absolutely no strife. Living the timeless life.
You've been watching a Bob the Fish production. Thanks! If you haven't found it already, be sure to check out our website at bobthefish.org.uk. Literally hundreds of videos not unlike this one that will make you laugh, think and realise new things or your money back. Which works out great because they're all absolutely free. All of this is possible thanks to the not unique way that Bob the Fish productions are paid for by you, the viewing public, via Patreon. For a donation of as little as £1 a month, not only do you ensure that I still have food and shelter so I can carry on making these programmes, but you could become eligible for a whole host of cool extras. New video essays, special event live streams, all my content a week in advance, and my book on the history of the BBC, Rule the Waves, chapter by chapter as it's written. And some cake, if you go out and buy a cake and eat it while you're watching. And if you don't want to support on a monthly basis, you can make a one-off donation via coffee. It all helps stave off scurvy. bobthefish.org.uk. You make it what it is.